Good day. Between the 15th and 17th of December, a US official, US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Karen Donfried, US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, visited Moscow, where she had talks with the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov. The Russian readout of their discussions is extremely brief. It reads as follows. On December 15th, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov met with US Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Karen Donfried. They had a detailed discussion of security guarantees in the context of the persistent attempts by the US and NATO to change the European military and political situation in their favor. The last words, by the way, amount practically to a rebuke, in effect, a statement by the Russians that the US and NATO have been endangering the peace of Europe by constant actions, persistent attempts to change the European military and political situation in their favor. Note that this meeting was between Ryabkov and Donfried. The other US Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, who came to Moscow a few weeks ago and had a disastrous meeting with Ryabkov when she came. She was not the person sent this time. Somebody in Washington correctly decided that sending a neocon official like Nuland would simply exacerbate tensions between the Russians, given the nature of the discussions with Ryabkov which are taking place. And on this occasion, at least, sense prevailed, and instead of Nuland, they sent Donfried instead. Anyway, let's not spend too much time trying to work out what Ryabkov and Donfried might have said to each other. The primary reason why Donfried visited Moscow was in order to receive two documents that the Russians have been preparing, documents that essentially follow up Vladimir Putin's comments of a few weeks ago that Russia now has red lines and is looking for security guarantees. And these two documents, one a treaty between Russia and the United States, the other an agreement between Russia and NATO, are clearly intended by the Russians to set out their position and to set out their objectives in order to achieve that new restructuring of European security architecture that Putin was discussing when he spoke about this treaty and about Russia needing legal and secure guarantees for the situation on its western border. Those comments which Putin made about this just over 2 weeks ago. So what are these two agreements, these two documents that Ryabkov handed over to Donfried? They are, briefly, a treaty between the United States and Russia on security guarantees, and the other is an agreement on measures between Russia and NATO. The reason the agreement between Russia and NATO is an agreement, not a treaty, is that NATO, of course, is not a state, so it cannot therefore enter into treaty conditions, treaty agreements with other parties, because it is states which agree treaties with each other, not really organizations. Having said that, there's no doubt that if this agreement were made, it would become a part of international law. And I would add that almost certainly, if this agreement were ever agreed, which is a huge if, by the way, if this agreement were ever agreed, I'm fairly sure that the Russians would, within a fairly short time, insist upon this agreement being converted into an outright treaty, one agreed to formally, signed and ratified by all the European states, as well as Russia and the United States. It would, in other words, provide a framework, an eventual framework, for an entire new security agreement in Europe, and is clearly intended to be a stepping stone, though a major stepping stone, towards that objective. Now, I'm going to say straight away, these two documents, the treaty between Russia and the United States on security guarantees, and the agreement on measures between Russia and NATO, were they ever accepted, would represent a diplomatic and geopolitical revolution. They would not only mean the end of NATO expansion and acceptance by the Western powers of Russia's red lines, but to all intents and purposes, they would reverse the expansion of NATO eastwards, which has been taking place since the mid-1990s. In order to explain that, I'm going to have to go through these agreements in detail in a moment. Don't worry, I should say these agreements are fairly short, so we should be able to do that fairly quickly. I would also add that in the nature of these agreements, were they ever accepted, it would mean a revival of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, that the United States walked out of in the last days of the Trump administration. And it would also, in effect, mean the end of the US anti-ballistic missile program that the United States has been busy installing in Eastern Europe. So this would be a radical change in the entire security architecture, the entire geopolitical situation in Europe today. It goes well beyond Russia's red lines. It goes, in effect, it proposes, in effect, a complete restructuring of the geopolitical treaty architecture, the security architecture in Europe. I'm going to add further that if these two agreements were ever accepted, it's difficult to imagine that NATO, at least in its current form, would be able to survive. Anyway, let's first go to the first treaty, which is the draft treaty that the Russians are proposing between the United States and Russia. And I'm going to skip the preamble. I'm not saying that preamble isn't of vital importance. It's extremely important, but it doesn't go to the actual commitments that the two sides, Russia and the United States, would be taking on, treaty commitments, which are, of course, at the heart of this treaty. And I'm going to read the various articles of the treaty, that's to say, the various clauses of the treaty. There are 7 of them, and that won't take us very, very long. So the first one is Article 1. The parties shall cooperate on the basis of principles of indivisible, equal, and undiminished security, and to these ends shall not undertake actions nor participate in or support activities that affect the security of the other party, shall not implement security measures adopted by each party individually in the framework of an international organization, military or alliance or coalition that could undermine core security interests of the other party. Now, this article does in effect 2 things. It says that Russia and the United States are equal parties the word equal is there, but it talks about indivisible and undiminished security. It places Russian security interests on an equal footing with those of the United States, something the United States has consistently resisted ever since the end of the Second World War. The United States has never really agreed to any kind of treaty or formula whereby its security interests are placed on an equal footing with those of any other power. Well, this treaty actually insists upon that, but of course, the further point, and perhaps in some ways the more pertinent point, is that this article implicitly recognizes Russia's Russia's red lines. And the key words are that the parties shall not implement security measures adopted by each party individually or in the framework of an international organization, military alliance, or coalition that could undermine core security interests of the other party. So, Russia recognizes that the United States has core security interests. It always has, by the way, and in effect, red lines. But the United States also recognizes that Russia has core security interests, in effect, red lines, and commits to making no measure, either by itself or in combination with any other alliance, organization, or country, obviously including NATO, but conceivably any other country organization, that would in any way threaten or undermine Russia's core interests, in effect, its red lines. So Article 1 recognizes Russia's core interests and red lines and says that Russian security is equal with the United States. And by the way, the article also talks about indivisible security. The point it is making is that US security cannot be achieved by sacrificing Russian security. Security is indivisible. What that means is that the United States cannot achieve real security at the expense of any other country, and certainly not of Russia at the present time. That, by the way, is a concept that the United States has also, up to now, resisted, even though it has in the past agreed to it in various agreements that were made over the course of the Cold War. Anyway, to proceed, Article 2. The parties shall seek to ensure that all international organizations, military alliances, and coalitions in which at least one of the parties is taking part adhere to the principles contained in the Charter of the United Nations. What that says is no more regime change wars. In future, it is the Security Council of the United Nations, and that alone, which decides where there is a threat to peace and which authorizes military action should there be a threat to peace. The United States and its allies are no longer to do that unilaterally. And by recognizing and accepting and adhering to the principles contained in the Charter of the United Nations, the United States recognizes the sovereignty of other countries, accepts that those countries cannot be invaded, and when they are, that would amount to aggression against those countries, and by definition and implication, it also means that attempts to meddle in the internal affairs of these countries in order to achieve color revolutions there, that too is something that the United States, under this article, would have to cease to do. Again, the language is, shall we say, bland, the implications of this article are immense. Then Article 3, the parties shall not use the territories of other states with a view to preparing or carrying out an armed attack against the other party or other actions affecting core security interests of the other party. Note again the reference to core security interests. Russia has core security interests, just as the United States does. The United States cannot deploy military forces in countries, including countries that are not necessarily members of NATO, which might threaten Russia. Of course, by analogy, Russia cannot do the same in order to threaten the United States, but you have to go back, you have to reel back to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 to find a situation where the Russians did deploy military systems in a third country, in that case Cuba, which could potentially have affected the core security interests of the United States. The Russians have never done that at any time since then. So, no more US bases in countries like Ukraine. Of course, they don't have bases there, but they do have some kind of military infrastructure. But no bases there, no bases in place in countries like Turkey, like Poland. I mean, note that this article doesn't say that the US can't. Doesn't make a distinction between NATO countries and non-NATO countries. It simply says that the parties shall not use the territories of other states with a view to preparing or carrying out an armed attack against the other party, or actions affecting core security interests of the other party. So, no forward positioning of US troops in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Romania, no anti-ballistic missile interceptors deployed in Poland or Romania. Again, a demand which would completely change the entire US military posture, which has been ever since the start of the Cold War, to try to forward position military forces as close to Russia's borders or the Soviet Union's borders as possible in preparation for a war against that country. And then the next article, Article 4. The United States of America shall undertake to prevent further eastward expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and deny accession to the alliance to the states of the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The United States shall not establish military bases in the territory of the states of the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics that are not members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, use their infrastructure for any military activities, or develop bilateral military cooperation with them. So, no eastward expansion of NATO into the territory of the former Soviet Union, and no more military engagement with the countries that were former constituent republics of the Soviet Union, not at all, not even sending advisors there, or weapon systems there, or engaging in any form of bilateral military cooperation with them. Nothing. In other words, these countries are to be either completely neutral, or if they prefer, they can enter into security arrangements with Russia, but they will not enter into any kind of security association or cooperation systems with the United States in any way whatsoever. That's again an astonishing demand. It in effect tells the United States that the whole territory of the former Soviet Union is henceforth a no-go area for the United States. And of course, it would mean the end of any aspirations by Georgia and Ukraine ever to enter NATO. But that's perhaps the least of it. And note that the United States shall not establish military bases in the territory of the states of the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So there we go. So no more bases in places in Central Asia. The United States had bases for a certain period after the 9/11 attacks in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. Bases like that from now on out of the question. End of anything of that nature. Then Article 5. The parties shall refrain from deploying their armed forces and armaments, including in the framework of international organizations, military alliances, or coalitions, in the area where such deployment could be perceived by the other party as a threat to its national security, with the exception of such deployment within the national territories of the parties. The parties shall refrain from flying heavy bombers equipped for nuclear or non-nuclear armaments, or deploying surface warships of any type, including in the framework of international organizations, military alliances, or coalitions, in the area outside national airspace and national territorial waters, respectively, for where they can attack targets in the territory of the other party. The parties shall maintain dialogue and cooperate to improve mechanisms to prevent dangerous military activities on or over the high seas, including agreeing on the maximum approach distance between warships and aircraft. So, no Western warships, no NATO warships, no US warships in the Black Sea, close to Russia, no ships steaming close to the Crimea, or navigating around Kaliningrad and Leningrad and St. Petersburg, Leningrad region in the Baltics. No US warships probing Russian naval bases in the Arctic, in places like Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, and in the Kola Peninsula, or near Vladivostok, and in the Sea of Okhotsk. Nothing like that in future. No US or NATO flights of aircraft close to Russian borders. No deployment of US forces of any sort. Ground forces, anti-missile forces in territories close to Russia where they might potentially threaten Russia. Again, something that the United States has always resisted up to now. They've always, as we know, insisted on their so-called right of freedom of navigation wherever they choose, provided it's international waters, and they've always insisted on their right to sail their warships close to places like the Crimea, or the Kola Peninsula, or Vladivostok, as and when they choose, even though countries like Russia find that very threatening. The United States has never agreed to this at any time. And of course, were it to agree to this with Russia, as night follows day, China would insist on the same thing. It would make equal and equivalent demands about the South China Sea, the North China Sea, and the Straits of Taiwan. So again, a massive change in the whole US strategic posture if a treaty like this were ever agreed. Article 6. The parties shall undertake not to deploy ground-launched intermediate range and short-range missiles outside their national territories, as well as in the areas of their national territories from which such weapons can attack targets in the national territory of the other party. So, back to the INF Treaty, but with a twist. The United States cannot deploy intermediate nuclear forces in Europe. That is, from that moment on, from the moment that this treaty were accepted, that would become impossible. No cruise missiles no US cruise missiles in Europe, no Pershing II missiles. Obviously, these are missiles from the 1980s. They don't exist at the present time, but no analogous missiles like that in Europe. A return, in other words, to US obligations under the INF Treaty. But with a twist, because note that under Article 6, the same doesn't exactly apply to Russia. Russia is allowed to have intermediate range and short range missiles on its national territory, that is to say, within Russia itself. The prohibition is on having systems, intermediate range and short range missiles on its territory, which could reach the territory of the United States, which of course they cannot do from Russia because they are intermediate range or short range. So the Russians can have their Iskander missiles in Europe, they can increase their range, they can bring into service new intermediate range nuclear missiles in Europe, cruise missiles and such things, but provided they are positioned on Russian national territory, they are not covered by this article. This article reinstates the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, but it changes its terms. It allows the Russians to have intermediate range and short range nuclear missiles on their territory where they can reach all parts of Europe, but the United States cannot position analogous systems in Europe because they would be able to reach Russia. So it's, again, a radical shift, something that the United States obviously has never agreed to in the past and which the United States would vigorously oppose. I would add that what it actually does is that it puts Russia and the United States again in a position of equality. The Russians, at the time of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, de facto accepted that Russia would never position intermediate range and short range nuclear missiles within range of US territory. So there would be in future no such missiles positioned in Cuba or by definition in any other Latin American state, not in Mexico, not anywhere like that. And the Russians, of course, have accepted that and they've respected it. The United States has never accepted the same geographical restriction upon itself. It did withdraw Jupiter missiles and other missiles from Turkey and Italy, which had deployed in advance of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was part of the deal that was done with the Soviets in 1962. But the United States never entered into a commitment that they would not return such missiles to Europe. And of course, in the 1980s, they did so when they deployed for a period of time cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe. Well, in future, just as the Russians are prohibited from having intermediate and nuclear missiles which can reach the United States from the territories of such countries as Cuba, so the United States would be prohibited from positioning such missile systems in Europe where they could reach Russia. So the two countries would find themselves in a position of perfect symmetry, perfect equality, something which, as I said, up to now, the United States has resisted. And then Article 7. The parties shall refrain from deploying nuclear weapons outside their national territories and return such weapons already deployed outside their national territories at the time of the entry into force of the treaty of their national to their national territories. The parties shall eliminate all existing infrastructure for deployment of nuclear weapons outside their national territories. The parties shall not train military and civilian personnel from non-nuclear countries to use nuclear weapons. The parties shall not conduct exercises or training for general purpose forces that include scenarios involving the use of nuclear weapons. Now, again, that is a radical change from the existing security architecture. Up to now, and in fact, to all intents and purposes, the Russians have never deployed, at least not to any extent that we know about, nuclear weapons outside their own territory. The Soviet Union did, to a limited extent. There is reason to believe, in fact, it's fairly well established, that Soviet forces in Eastern Germany did possess nuclear weapons, and of course the Soviet Union did briefly deploy nuclear weapons to Cuba. But the Soviets have never forward positioned nuclear weapons on anything like the scale that the United States has done. The United States has forward deployed nuclear weapons in Europe amongst its NATO allies, in countries like Germany. It's also got nuclear weapons forward positioned at the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. And of course, it's also got nuclear weapons forward positioned in Okinawa, at its base in Okinawa, which is in Japan, part of the sovereign territory of Japan, and in South Korea. And it's quite possible, likely even, that the United States has pre-positioned nuclear weapons in several other countries as well, except of course that we don't know about it. And the United States is not to share nuclear weapons technology. Now, what constitutes a nuclear weapon can be very much a matter of opinion or interpretation, but one can see, and if the argument, by the way, is already being made, that the United States supplying nuclear submarine technology to Australia breaches the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which forbids the transfer of nuclear technology to other countries. And I suspect that if this treaty were ever agreed, the Russians would say that the AUKUS agreement, the agreement to transfer nuclear submarine technology to Australia, that might also conceivably be claimed by the Russians to violate Article 7. I say that, though it's now fairly well established that the Russians have been sharing similar technology, nuclear submarine technology, with India and China. But anyway, that's what the treaty would do. Now, it would be a radical change, again, something that the United States has never agreed to up to now, and we'll discuss the prospects of it ever agreeing to anything like this in a moment. And then we have Article 8. The treaty shall enter into force from the date of receipt of the last written notification on the completion by their parties of their domestic procedures necessary for its entry into force. Now, that may not seem particularly important, but this is a treaty, and Article 8 makes it absolutely clear that the Russians will not accept anything less, and what that means is that they expect the US Senate to ratify this treaty. And ratification of treaties requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate. And of course, just to anticipate what I'm going to say, the Senate is populated by neocons and hardliners, people like Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Senator Menendez, Senator Wicker, people like that. That is the institution which would have to ratify this treaty, and Article 8 makes it clear that that is what the Russians expect and even demand. So that is the treaty. In effect, a total dismantling of the entire US strategic military posture, a total reversal of US foreign policy, the end of the United States as an exceptionalist power, a complete transformation of US policy, the US becoming an ordinary power, like, if you like, Russia is or China is, more powerful than most, but no longer the exceptional country, no longer the world's policeman. Anyway, that's the treaty. Let's now come on to the agreement between Russia and NATO, which is also being proposed. This is also, I would say, fairly short. And again, I'm going to skip the preamble. Not that that is unimportant, but I will go directly to the articles. Article 1. The parties shall guide in their relations by the principles of cooperation, equal and indivisible security. Notice again those words, equal and indivisible security. Security cannot be established by one side at the expense of the other. That is not security at all. A formula that the Russians have insisted on, one which the Western powers have always resisted. To continue, they shall not strengthen their security individually within international organizations, military coalitions, military alliances, at the expense of the security of other parties. The parties shall settle all international disputes in their mutual relations by peaceful means and refrain from the use or threat of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The parties shall not create conditions or situations that pose or could be perceived as a threat to the national security of other parties. The parties shall exercise restraint in military planning and conducting exercises to reduce risks of eventual dangerous situations in accordance with their obligations under international law, including those set out in intergovernmental agreements on the prevention of incidents at sea, outside territorial waters, and in the airspace above, as well as in intergovernmental agreements on the prevention of dangerous military activities. So, in effect, no further military adventures by NATO in places like Libya and Afghanistan, no NATO deployments or exercises or flights or deployments of warships in places close to Crimea, Kaliningrad, Leningrad region, St. Petersburg, Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, the Kola Peninsula, Vladivostok, or the rest. By the way, no similar Russian exercises or deployments close to the coastlines of NATO powers. But then, of course, that's never been the great issue. In other words, a policy of peace instead of the policy of exceptionalism and, I would say, military aggrandizement we've seen from NATO up to now. Then we go on to Article 2. In order to address issues and settle problems, the parties shall use the mechanisms of urgent bilateral or multilateral consultations, including the NATO-Russia Council. The parties shall regularly and voluntarily exchange assessments of contemporary threats and security challenges, inform each other about military exercises and maneuvers, and main provisions of their military doctrines. All existing mechanisms and tools for confidence-building measures shall be used in order to ensure transparency and predictability of military activities. Telephone hotlines shall be established to maintain emergency contacts between the parties. Well, in other words, total transparency, total information of the one about the other, hotlines, exchanges of information, confidence building measures, all those things left over from the time of the Cold War, which to a great extent NATO has abandoned over the last 10 years especially. So a return to that. Article 3. The parties reaffirm that they do not consider each other as adversaries. The parties shall maintain dialogue and interaction on improving mechanisms to prevent incidents on or over the high seas, primarily in the Baltics and the Black Sea regions. So, no more deployments, as I said, close to Crimea and Kaliningrad. And when Western warships do enter the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, as they must do, because of course there are NATO powers which have coastlines with these seas, they need to keep the Russians informed about what they are doing. But the key word in this paragraph is that they do not consider each other as adversaries. Of course, NATO at the moment openly refers to Russia as an adversary, and it means, in effect, that NATO, if it were to accept this agreement, Article 3 would mean that it would cease to consider Russia an enemy, and it would instead have to look to Russia as a partner, or perhaps in time, even as a friend. Then Article 4. The Russian Federation and all the parties that were members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as of 27th May 1997, note the year, shall not deploy military forces and weaponry in the territory of any of the other states in Europe, in addition to the forces stationed on that territory as of 27th May 1997. With the consent of all the parties, such deployments can take place in exceptional cases to eliminate a threat to security in one or more parties. Now, that essentially reverses the eastward expansion of NATO. It means that countries like Poland, the Czech and Slovak republics, Romania, Bulgaria, the states that used to make up Yugoslavia, Hungary, all of these countries, they would have to reduce the size of their armed forces back to what they were in 1997, and all Western forces, all American, British, German forces deployed on their territories, I would add, by the way, the Baltic states, they would have to be withdrawn from these countries. So, in effect, the whole of NATO military infrastructure created east of Germany after 1997, 1997 being the year when eastward expansion beyond the territory of Germany began, all of that would have to be dismantled and reversed. Countries like the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, the rest, the Baltic states too, would remain part of NATO. There's no actual mechanism for forcing countries to leave NATO, but they would no longer be they would no longer host NATO troops or infrastructure on their territories. They would, in effect, be a second-class members of NATO. So, in effect, the whole process of NATO expansion, as it was conducted and pursued after 1997, would be rolled back. Countries in Eastern Europe would be members of NATO in name only. They would no longer be part of the NATO infrastructure in the way that they were before. And that, I would say, in my opinion, is the single most important provision in both of these two documents, it in effect reverses the whole system of NATO expansion as it happened since 1997. An expansion of NATO, which the Russians have repeatedly said, was correctly, by the way, was carried out in violation of promises given to themselves back in at the time when the Cold War ended, and also the creation of all this infrastructure, this NATO infrastructure in the Eastern European states. The Russians say that that also is a violation of agreements that were made or of promises that were made to them at the time when NATO expansion first began in 1997, and they see that those agreements, those promises have been violated too. So an complete dismantling of everything that was done post 1997, in effect, a return to the arrangements as envisaged by the Soviet and Western leaders at the end of the Cold War. Germany would join NATO. There would be no eastward expansion of NATO beyond the territory of Germany. Countries that have, in fact, joined NATO in violation of that promise would remain formal members of the alliance, but in reality and in practice, they would be members of that alliance in name only. So, a radical change, to put it mildly, but one which I suspect is going to be at the forefront of Russian demands going forward. Then Article 5 builds on the point about the INF Treaty made in the treaty between the United States and Russia. The parties shall not deploy land-based intermediate and short-range missiles in areas allowing them to reach the territory of the other parties. Now, notice the words here are chosen extremely carefully. But firstly, this prevents Western countries, the two NATO nuclear powers, which are not, apart from the United States, it prevents them, Britain and France, from developing intermediate nuclear and short-range missiles and positioning them in Germany if US forces leave, and that since intermediate nuclear forces positioned in Britain and France would be able to reach Russian territory, that in effect prohibits Britain and France from developing intermediate nuclear weapons, replacing those of the United States. But, as I said before, the Russians would be allowed to have intermediate nuclear weapons. The only difference is that they could have all of those intermediate nuclear weapons, their Iskander missiles, their long-range cruise missiles, all of those things. But they would not deploy them in areas allowing them to reach the territory of European NATO states. So they would have to be held back by the Russians, in effect, in Siberia, beyond the Urals. So it allows the Russians to develop these systems, but it restricts their areas of deployment. They would not be able to position them, according to this treaty, in the European territories of Russia where they could reach Europe. So that's, in effect, the INF Treaty brought back, but with a twist that I said before. The previous treaty, the original INF Treaty, prevented Russia from having such weapon systems at all. This treaty would allow the Russians to develop such weapons, just as it allows the United States to develop such weapons, but the Russians would be restricted in where they could deploy them just as the United States would. It would create, as I said, symmetry, equality between the United States and Russia. Then Article 6, all member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization commit themselves to refrain from any further enlargement of NATO, including the accession of Ukraine, as well as other states. Note the specific reference to Ukraine, but obviously this takes in Georgia and Moldova. By the way, it also takes in Serbia, Bosnia, countries like that. So in effect, it brings a stop, a complete stop to NATO expansion. Article 7. The parties that are members of states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization shall not conduct any military activity on the territory of Ukraine, as well as other states in the Eastern Europe, in the South Caucasus, and in Central Asia. In order to exclude incidents, the Russian Federation and the parties that are member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization shall not conduct military exercises or other military activities above the brigade level in a zone of agreed width and configuration on each side of the borderline of the Russian Federation and the states in a military alliance with it, as well as parties that are member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So, no military presence, not just by the United States, but by its allies. No British troops, going to the Caucasus or Central Asia, or of course Ukraine. The Americans are prohibited from doing that by the treaty. The Russians want them to agree, but other NATO member states would be prohibited from doing that also. So, in effect, the entire territory of the former Soviet Union, except of course for the 3 Baltic states, becomes a military no-go area for the Western powers. Not just the United States, but all of them. And of course, they are not allowed to conduct drills or exercises anywhere close to Russian territory. So no warships, no British frigates sailing close to Crimea or anything like that in future. Again, a drastic change in the entire military posture of NATO. Then Article 8. The agreement shall not affect and shall not be interpreted as affecting the primary responsibility of the Security Council for maintaining international peace and security, nor the rights and obligations of the parties under the Charter of the United Nations. So, no more unilateral regime change wars, no possibility of NATO conducting interventions in Afghanistan and Yugoslavia and Libya. The only organization and institution authorized to enable, to direct military action against any state is the Security Council of the United Nations, in accordance with Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Again, a radical change in the military system. And then Article 9 is a tidying up provision, setting up the mechanisms for ratification of this treaty, of this agreement, and of the way in which it enters into force. Well, overall, as I said, a geostrategic revolution. If these treaties were ever accepted and agreed, the whole Western military alliance system, as we have known it, would in effect cease to exist. We would no longer have regime change wars around the world. We would no longer have Western exceptionalism. We would have a completely different security situation in Europe. This endless program of democracy promotion, in effect even of globalization, would come to a complete stop. Now, the most interesting thing about these two agreements is that the United States has received them, and of course, from the US point of view, they are completely unacceptable. It is inconceivable that the United States at the present time would agree to either of these agreements. And of course, the prospects of the treaty gaining ratification in the US Senate for the moment is nil. But despite that, the United States has not rejected these two documents out of hand. On the contrary, they've said that they would be a basis for discussion. Nothing illustrates more starkly the change in the balance of forces in Europe, and indeed between Russia and the West, than the fact that the Americans are even prepared to talk about agreements and documents and treaties of this nature. Already, I would argue, that is a transformation of the international situation. It speaks of a radical shift in the global balance of power. Now, will these treaties in these forms ever crystallize? Will we ever get treaties like this? Well, not anytime soon. As I said, in their present form, they're unacceptable to the United States. They are unacceptable to the NATO powers. The British would be horrified by an agreement like this. And of course, so would the Poles, so would the Baltic states, so would other countries. But if one looks forward to the much longer term, say in 10 years' time, with perhaps the balance of power changing even further away from the United States and in Russia's and China's favor, well, at that point, as a long-term agreement, it's possible that we could start to see something along these lines being formally agreed at last. Because if we think about it, what the Russians are demanding is not unreasonable. They want peace in Europe, their security to be accepted in Europe, their core interests to be recognized. They're saying they're not seeking to threaten any Western country, but they do want peace and stability in Europe, which is what, after all, they were promised at the end of the Cold War. And given that this does not impinge in any significant way on US core interests or on the security of the United States or on the Western powers, we can perhaps see a situation where one day the United States might decide that agreeing to something like this is in its interests too. Certainly, I think so. But as I said, we are a long way from that point yet. And the fact that the Russians have presented the United States with these documents, firstly, we should see them more as an aspiration and as a long-term objective, but also as an indication of what the Russians are working towards, but also perhaps more as the shape of things one day to come than as anything that we will see happen in the short term. Anyway, as I said, the remarkable thing is that the Russians are now making these proposals and that the United States is willing to discuss them. The fact that the United States is willing to discuss them, by the way, explains why it wasn't Victoria Nuland who was sent to receive these documents. Had someone like that been offered them, well, one can imagine what her reaction would have been. It's not inconceivable that she would have torn them up in Ryabkov's presence or done something foolish like that. Anyway, we have a long journey before us before anything like this is ever agreed. We will see where that happens. I'm almost up to an hour. I've told I shouldn't exceed it. I'm not going to. Go to our shop, go to Locals, check us out on our other platforms, buy from our shop, tick the like button if you've liked this video, check your subscription, and thank you for joining me today.